Ever get that feeling? Like you just know something, even though you haven't actually seen it. We're diving into the possibility that maybe, just maybe, some of us can actually see without seeing through, remote viewing.
Yeah, it's a fascinating area where the line between science fiction and cutting-edge research starts to blur.
Right. Psychic spies, seeing across continents. But we're grounding this deep dive in some solid data. You provided us with this incredible meta-analysis of remote viewing studies.
And a meta-analysis is perfect for this. It lets us combine findings from, tons of individual studies, so we get a much clearer picture of what's actually going on rather than just one study's results.
Like instead of relying on one person saying remote viewing totally works,
Yeah.
and another saying no, bunk science, we're looking at the bigger picture.
Exactly. And that's key because remote viewing has been, well, notoriously difficult to study. A meta-analysis helps us cut through some of that noise and see if there's a real signal there.
Okay, so what's the verdict? After crunching all those numbers, is there actual evidence for remote viewing?
Okay, so this meta-analysis looked at 36 studies on remote viewing.
Wow, that's a lot.
Right, it's a really significant sample size. And what really jumped out was that they found a statistically significant trend, a strong effect size.
Okay, time for a quick translation for those of us who don't speak fluent statistics. What does a strong effect size actually tell us in plain English?
Basically, it means something beyond just random chance is likely going on. Now, this doesn't automatically mean everyone's psychic, but does tell us we shouldn't just dismiss remote viewing out of hand.
Interesting. So we've got this statistically significant hint that something's happening, but it doesn't necessarily mean we've proven remote viewing itself is the cause.
Exactly. We need to be both open-minded and skeptical at the same time. These findings definitely call for a closer look, though.
And this meta-analysis got even more interesting. It didn't just look at remote viewing in a vacuum. It compared it to other methods people have used to try to tap into ESP, like, Ganzfeld experiments, those sensory deprivation tanks.
Right, and they also compared it to precognitive tasks, where people try to predict future events.
So how did remote viewing stack up against those other contenders? Was it the ESP All-Star?
This is where it gets really interesting, actually. Remote viewing actually outperformed the other ESP methods they looked at.
Wow. Not only did it show a statistically significant effect, but it had even stronger results than these other, maybe better-known ESP techniques.
Right, precisely. And that alone begs the question, what is it about remote viewing that might lead to stronger ESP effects? It's a huge point for further research.
Huge is an understatement. Now, I'm dying to know, did they find out if some people are just natural-born remote viewers? Or can anyone learn this stuff? Like, do I need to sign up for, psychic spy school?
This is where the findings might surprise you. They actually didn't find a big difference in the results between people who had gone through formal remote viewing training and those who hadn't.
Wait, really? You're telling me those intense training montages in movies are a total fabrication?
Well, it's not necessarily that simple. The meta-analysis didn't find a statistically significant difference, at least with the data available. But a lot of the studies they looked at didn't really dig into the specifics of different training methods or how long people had been training.
That makes sense. Like comparing someone who took a weekend cooking class to a professional chef. Both can cook, but their skill levels are going to be wildly different.
Exactly. So while this meta-analysis gives us a broad overview, we need to dive deeper into the who of remote viewing and figure out what role, if any, training plays. It's not the whole story.
Okay, so the jury's still out on whether you need to be a remote viewing master to get results. But what about the techniques themselves? Did the researchers look at different approaches to remote viewing?
They did. The two most common techniques in the studies were controlled remote viewing and extended remote viewing.
Those sound intriguing. Can you break those down for us regular folks who aren't fluent in psychic jargon?
Of course. Controlled remote viewing, or CRV, is the more structured approach. It uses specific steps and protocols to guide the viewer. Think of it as a more analytical and methodical way of tapping into that remote information.
So less about waiting for a psychic lightning bolt to strike and more about, okay, let's follow these steps and see what comes up.
Exactly. On the other hand, extended remote viewing, or ERV, emphasizes relaxation and internal focus.
So maybe something closer to meditation.
You got it. ERV often uses techniques similar to guided meditation to help the viewer quiet their mind and access deeper levels of perception.
It's fascinating how different those sound. Like two totally different approaches to the same goal. Do we know if one works better than the other?
That's where the meta-analysis hit a bit of a roadblock. There wasn't enough data to directly compare the effectiveness of CRV versus ERV.
Another mystery. I'd love to see a study pitting them head to head. Now, one thing that's always stood out to me about remote viewing is the role of the interviewer. It's not like you're just alone in a room with your thoughts. Can you explain what the interviewer does and if the research says anything about their impact on the results?
You're right. The interviewer, sometimes called a monitor, is a unique element in a lot of remote viewing sessions. Their job isn't to tell the viewer what to see, but to guide their attention, help them describe their impressions and make sure they're staying on track. Kind of like a mental coach.
It's interesting how important guidance seems to be in this whole process. Did the researchers find a link between having an interviewer and actually having like a successful remote viewing session?
This is another one of those intriguing findings. The meta-analysis actually found that studies where there was an interviewer present tended to have better results. Now, this doesn't mean it's impossible to have a successful remote viewing experience on your own, but it does hint that having a trained guide might amplify those abilities somehow.
That makes sense, though. It's like having an experienced wilderness guide when you're navigating unfamiliar territory. Their expertise can make all the difference.
Exactly. And it highlights how important the interpersonal dynamic might be in remote viewing, which is something you don't usually see in other types of ESP research.
Okay, so to recap, we've got some statistically significant clues that there's something real happening with remote viewing. But, we're not ready to rewrite the textbooks just yet.
Right, and we've got this really intriguing finding that remote viewing actually seems to outperform other ESP techniques, at least according to this meta-analysis.
And maybe the most surprising finding of all training might not be the be-all and end-all we assumed it was, though there's a lot more to unpack on that front.
Absolutely. There are still plenty of questions to answer, like how much of a role does the interviewer play in all of this? And what about that analytical overlay thing? It sounds like that can really mess with a remote viewer's results.
Yeah, can you explain what that is for our listeners who, are just tuning in?
Basically, analytical overlay is when your mind jumps to conclusions too quickly, trying to make sense of those intuitive flashes you're getting. So you might latch onto one little detail and then try to force everything else to fit that interpretation, even if it's not accurate.
So it's like if I get a sense of water and something big and metallic, my brain might jump to cruise ship, even if it's actually like a giant metal sculpture of a fish in a fountain.
Exactly. And that tendency to jump to conclusions can really muddy the waters in remote viewing. It's something both viewers and interviewers need to be super aware of.
Kind of like that game telephone where you whisper a phrase around a circle and it's totally different by the end.
Perfect analogy. And that's one thing that makes remote viewing different from, say, Ganzfeld experiments or dream ESP. In those techniques, it's more about just observing and reporting what comes up, not trying to analyze it on the fly.
So with remote viewing, you need more than just the ability to perceive things remotely. You also need the mental discipline to avoid letting your conscious mind get in the way.
Precisely. It's a real balancing act between opening yourself up to those subtle impressions and staying objective enough to avoid, projecting your own interpretations onto them.
That sounds tricky. No wonder those interviewers come in handy. Having someone there to help you stay on track must be invaluable.
Exactly. The interviewer isn't just there for company, they're a vital part of the process.
Okay, so if we assume for a moment that remote viewing works, even a little bit, it's not hard to imagine how it could be useful in the real world. Wasn't the CIA really into this stuff back in the day?
They definitely were. That's probably the most famous or infamous example of people trying to use remote viewing for practical purposes.
I know, it sounds like something straight out of a spy movie. But it was a real thing.
Oh, absolutely. There were actually several government-funded programs looking into the potential of using remote viewing for, intelligence gathering, the most well-known being Project Stargate. The idea was that trained remote viewers could potentially collect intel on enemy locations, activities, even their plans that would normally be impossible to access.
And in the world of espionage, where even a tiny advantage can make a huge difference, I can see why they'd be interested in anything that might give them an edge, even if it seemed a little out there.
Exactly. But whether those programs were actually successful is still up for debate. There are definitely some interesting stories, but separating fact from fiction, especially with all the secrecy surrounding those operations, is nearly impossible.
Right. You got classified information, conflicting accounts, and a whole lot of skepticism from the scientific community. It's a recipe for a mystery that'll probably never be fully solved.
And it's not just espionage either. People have explored using remote viewing in all sorts of fields archaeology, trying to find hidden artifacts, finance, even trying to predict the stock market.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. What's the main takeaway for our listener? What should they be thinking about after listening to all of this?
I think the key takeaway is this. While we can't definitively say remote viewing is 100% real based on this meta-analysis alone, the evidence is intriguing enough that we can't just ignore it. We've got these statistically significant trends suggesting something is going on, and the potential applications, if we can figure out how to harness it reliably, are mind-blowing.
It really does feel like we're just scratching the surface here. Even after decades of research, there's still so much we don't know.
Exactly. We need more rigorous research, more standardized methods, and frankly, more open-mindedness from the scientific community to really crack the code of remote viewing.
Even with my skeptical hat on, I can't help but get excited about the possibilities here. What would a world where we could use this ability at will look like? It would be revolutionary.
Absolutely. It would be a complete game changer. But until then, all we have is the research and the amazing stories of people who claim to have experienced remote viewing firsthand.
And speaking of those amazing stories, this meta-analysis didn't just focus on the hard data, did it? It also touched on the more subjective, personal experiences of remote viewers.
Yeah.
Especially how those experiences differ from other ESP phenomena.
Right. And for me, this is where things get really fascinating. It's not just about stats and probabilities anymore. It's about altered states of consciousness, the subtleties of perception, and what it actually feels like to experience remote viewing from the inside.
So, give us a glimpse into that world. What do these remote viewers say it's like? What's going on in their minds when they're allegedly tapping into this ability?
It definitely varies from person to person, but many describe it as a state of heightened awareness, almost like entering a flow state where information seems to come more effortlessly. But, and this is important, it's not like they're watching a movie playing out in their heads.
Really? So what is it like then?
They say it's not like ordinary vision at all. It's more symbolic, impressionistic. They might get fleeting images, physical sensations, strong feelings, or even just a powerful sense of knowing something about the target without any clear sensory input.
Wow, that's so different from how we usually experience the world. It's like they're accessing a whole other channel of information, one that bypasses our five senses entirely.
That's a great way to put it. And that brings us back to the role of the interviewer, or monitor, who can help make sense of these often vague impressions and keep the viewer from going too far down the rabbit hole of interpretation.
It's like they need a translator for this other channel of information, someone who can speak the language of remote viewing.
Exactly. Having a trained guide to help navigate those murky waters seems to be crucial, which again sets remote viewing apart from a lot of other ESP research.
It's like the old saying, 2 heads are better than 1, especially when one of those heads has spent years studying the art of remote viewing. Okay, so we've got this fascinating blend of subjective experiences and, attempts to measure them objectively. But what about the aspect of time? We've been talking about remote viewing in the present, but there's also this, mind-blowing possibility of viewing things in the past, or even the future, right?
Absolutely. And that's where we get into some of the most mind-boggling and hotly debated territory in this whole field.
Okay, hold on. We're talking about potentially looking back into history, or even like glimpsing the future, using only our minds. This is some next-level stuff. But seriously, the idea of precognitive remote viewing, seeing things that haven't even happened yet, it's both incredibly cool and kind of hard to wrap my head around.
It really challenges our everyday understanding of how time works, doesn't it? And while this meta-analysis didn't focus primarily on precognitive remote viewing, there were a few studies included that, did dip their toes into those waters.
And what did they find? Was there anything to support this idea that we can, peek into the future with remote viewing?
The findings weren't as strong as those for present-time remote viewing, but they were definitely intriguing enough to warrant more investigation. It's almost as if we're picking up these faint whispers from the future, but we need a more powerful receiver, so to speak, to really tune in.
Wow. So we've got remote viewing in the present, which is already pushing the limits of what we thought we knew, and now we're layering on this potential ability to tap into the past and future. That's a lot to process.
It really is, and it highlights how important it is to approach this whole field with a healthy balance of, open-mindedness and skepticism. We need to be willing to entertain some pretty wild ideas, but we also need to be rigorous in our research. to make sure we're not just chasing shadows.
Which brings us to something this meta-analysis really drove home. We desperately need more rigorous and standardized research methods in the field of remote viewing.
Absolutely. If we want to move beyond these intriguing anecdotes and really understand what's going on with remote viewing, we need solid, replicable data. And that means addressing some of the methodological challenges that have, dogged this field for decades.
Like what? What are some of the biggest hurdles researchers face when they try to study something as slippery as remote viewing?
Well, one of the biggest challenges is subjectivity. We're dealing with internal personal experiences, and those are incredibly difficult to standardize or measure objectively.
Right. How do you measure a feeling or a sense of knowing in a way that's consistent and reliable across different people? It sounds as if there's some kind of remote viewing center in the brain that we can just, stick someone in an fMRI machine and watch light up.
Not yet, anyway. And that's where the need for some really creative research designs and innovative approaches comes in. We need to find ways to study these subtle experiences in a way that's, both scientifically sound and respectful of the subjective nature of what we're trying to measure.
It's like trying to bottle lightning, isn't it? You need the right tools and techniques to capture something that's both powerful and fleeting.
Exactly. And then there's the issue of replicability, or rather the lack thereof. Historically, it's been really tough to get consistent results with remote viewing experiments, which has, understandably, fueled a lot of skepticism from the broader scientific community.
I get that. If you can't reliably reproduce results, it's hard to build a strong case that something real is going on.
Precisely. And that's one of the reasons this meta-analysis was so valuable. It tried to take a broader view to see if there were any consistent trends or patterns across a large number of studies. And as we've discussed, it did find some statistically significant effects.
But even with a meta-analysis, like you mentioned earlier, we have to be very careful about potential biases. Differences in how the studies were conducted, and the fact that not all studies are created equal. Some are going to be more rigorous than others.
Absolutely. It's a constant process of improvement and refinement. We need to learn from past research, identify any flaws or limitations, and design better, more rigorous studies moving forward.
And part of that means being aware of the experimenter effect, right? That's where the researcher's own beliefs or expectations can unintentionally influence the results of a study.
Exactly. If a researcher is absolutely convinced that remote viewing is real and they're hoping for positive results, that can subconsciously affect how they interact with the participants, how they analyze the data. It can creep in everywhere.
It's a good reminder that scientists are human too. And we all have our biases, even when we're trying our best to be objective.
Couldn't agree more. That's why it's so important to have open communication in the scientific community, peer review, and replication of findings by independent researchers. It's the only way to make sure we're building knowledge that's as solid as possible.
It sounds like the study of remote viewing, and maybe all of parapsychology, is like navigating a minefield of potential biases and pitfalls.
In some ways, it is, but that's true of any scientific field that's still in its early stages. It's all part of the process of moving from pure speculation to a deeper understanding, from those captivating anecdotes to a body of rock-solid evidence.
So despite all those challenges, it sounds like you're optimistic about the future of remote viewing research.
I am. I'm really excited by the growing number of researchers who are willing to take a fresh look at remote viewing and come up with innovative new ways to study it, because, let's face it, if there's even a tiny chance that we can tap into these extraordinary abilities, it's a chance worth taking.
Absolutely. It could completely change how we understand consciousness, perception, the nature of reality itself.
And who knows what other amazing discoveries might be waiting for us along the way.
It's like we're standing on the edge of something huge, a whole new frontier of human potential waiting to be explored.
I couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, on that note of excitement and possibility, I think we'll wrap up this deep dive for today. A huge thank you to our amazing expert for guiding us through this incredibly fascinating, often baffling, but always thought-provoking world of remote viewing. And to all of our listeners out there, thanks for coming along for the ride. Until next time, keep those minds open and stay curious.
You know, when we asked you to send in your most intriguing science mysteries, I don't think we are quite ready for this this research article you sent about Hessdalen Lights.
Oh, wow.
Those strange glowing orbs that people have been seeing up in the sky, mostly in Norway. But the real kicker is this article suggests they could be connected to something straight out of science fiction.
Okay.
Microscopic wormholes.
Yeah, that's a new one for me, for sure. It's interesting, though, because we typically, when we think about wormholes, we think about these massive objects that are connecting galaxies, like something out of Interstellar.
Right.
But there are some scientists who are seriously exploring the possibility that wormholes exist on a much smaller scale, and maybe even right here on Earth.
Okay, so hold on just a minute.
Yeah.
Mini wormholes
Yeah,
under our feet?
potentially.
Before we even get to that, let's remind everyone what the Hessdalen Lights even are, because we're not just talking about some unexplained blips on a radar screen, are we?
No, not at all.
Yeah.
This is a phenomenon that's been observed for decades.
All right.
And studied. I mean, you have researchers like Erling Strand and Massimo Tiederani doing some really serious work on this, collecting data, analyzing light spectra. I mean, they're going all in trying to figure out what these things are.
So this article that you sent us, this is like adding a whole other layer to an already pretty strange mystery.
Exactly. It's basically saying, what if these lights aren't just some unexplained atmospheric phenomenon, but something even weirder?
Yeah.
And that's where the idea of micro wormholes comes in.
All right, so walk me through this, because the article starts with a pretty out there claim. It suggests that there might be this tiny, stable wormhole that connects the center of the Earth to the sun.
Yeah, the center of the sun.
Okay, so I have to ask this.
Yeah.
If there's essentially a mini-sun at the Earth's core, why aren't we all, like, fried to a crisp?
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the first question that comes to mind. It's like, if there's this insanely hot thing in the middle of our planet, how are we even having this conversation?
Right.
And this is where it gets kind of crazy. The paper argues that this central wormhole would be unbelievably small. We're talking micrometers here. Smaller than the width of a human hair.
So like a pinprick of unimaginable heat.
Yeah, you could think of it that way, and it's a pinprick so tiny that it doesn't melt the entire planet. But here's the thing. That central wormhole is just the start. The paper proposes that this wormhole could have branches, and these branches would be temporary, unstable wormholes that connect to random points in the Earth's subsoil.
So you're saying that these wormhole branches, if they exist, are like little cracks in space-time, and Hessdalen just happens to be sitting on a particularly active fault line.
That's one way to think about it, yeah.
Yeah.
The paper even suggests that Hessdalen might sit on something like an active BBL tank, a region where these wormhole branches are more likely to erupt, similar to how magma chambers under volcanoes lead to more frequent eruptions.
So if we run with this whole BBL tank idea for a minute, does that mean that Hessdalen is just unlucky?
Or lucky, depending on how you look at it, right?
Yeah.
I mean, imagine having a front row seat to potential wormhole activity.
Okay, so we've got these potential wormhole branches popping up like cosmic geysers, but how does a microscopic crack in space-time actually create something as bright and noticeable as these Hessdalen lights? I mean, we're not talking about some faint glow here. People are seeing these things with the naked eye.
Yeah, you're talking about a lot of energy being released.
Right.
And that's where the physics gets really interesting, because the paper suggests that even a nanometer-sized wormhole, we're talking smaller than a virus, could act as just this insane energy source.
We're talking temperatures hotter than the surface of the sun, right? How does anything, even something that tiny, contain that much energy without instantly vaporizing everything around it?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's something the paper addresses head-on. Basically, they argue that while the temperatures involved are extreme, the total energy that's actually being transferred is still relatively small because of just how incredibly tiny the wormhole is.
Oh, okay.
So think of it like a single grain of sand that's been heated to millions of degrees. I mean, it's unbelievably hot.
Right.
But it's not going to melt a glacier.
It's like a super-concentrated burst of energy, but on this tiny scale.
Exactly.
But how does that energy become light? What are we actually seeing?
So the paper proposes a model called photoionization. And basically what they're saying is that this intense radiation that's coming from the wormhole, it excites the air molecules around it, and that causes them to emit light.
So it's not the wormhole itself we're seeing, it's the air around it going haywire.
That's a good way to think about it.
Like a miniature aurora borealis, but triggered by a wormhole instead of solar winds.
Yeah, that's a great analogy.
Okay.
But here's where it gets even weirder.
Okay.
There's another mystery surrounding Hessdalen Lights, and that's their speed.
How?
Witnesses often describe them as moving incredibly fast, sometimes even faster than the speed of sound.
Whoa, hold on a second. If something is zipping around that fast, shouldn't we be hearing a sonic boom?
You'd think so, right?
I mean, that's like physics 101.
Yeah, it's a really good point. But here's the thing. No one has reported hearing sonic booms that are associated with Hessdalen Lights.
Okay, so now my mind is officially blown.
Yeah, it's one of those things that makes you really question what's going on.
How do you explain that?
Well, the paper offers a couple of really interesting possibilities.
Hmm.
One is that the sonic boom might be happening, but it's happening in the ultrasonic range, so it's too high-pitched for us to hear.
So maybe we need to set up some special microphones in Hessdalen, something that can record those super high frequencies and see if we can capture these silent sonic booms.
That's one idea, and it's something the paper actually suggests for future research.
Oh, wow.
But they also propose another, even more mind-blowing possibility. What if the movement we're seeing is an illusion?
Wait, an illusion? How do you even have an illusion of movement when we're talking about something physical, like light?
Well, remember how we were talking about these wormhole branches constantly forming and shifting and disappearing? So imagine, instead of a single object moving through the air, what we're seeing is the rapid-fire sequence of these micro wormholes opening and closing, so each one ionizes a little pocket of air, creates a flash of light, and then disappears.
So it's like our eyes are being tricked, like a cosmic flip book where each page is a new wormhole opening and closing, and that creates this illusion of movement, even though nothing is actually traveling that distance.
Exactly.
Wow.
And I think that really highlights how differently we might need to think about this phenomenon. We can't necessarily apply our everyday understanding of physics to something as potentially strange and amazing as a microscopic wormhole.
This is blowing my mind. So if we entertain this idea even for a minute, if this paper is onto something, if there really are microscopic wormholes popping up beneath our feet, what does that mean?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And I think if this theory is even partially correct, it completely changes our understanding of, well, pretty much everything. It means that wormholes might be far more common and much, much smaller than we ever imagined. Instead of being these massive distortions in space-time connecting galaxies, they could be these tiny ephemeral things flickering in and out of existence all around us.
It's like suddenly realizing there's a whole other dimension hidden within our own, and these Hessdalen lights, these little flickers and flashes, they're like glimpses into that hidden world.
Yeah, and who knows what else might be hiding there.
It's like we always talk about looking up at the stars to find the universe's biggest mysteries, but what if some of them are right here under our feet?
Yeah, or under our hiking boots if you're in Hessdalen.
Yeah. Exactly. It really makes you think. And it's like what we always say, it's amazing where scientific curiosity can lead you. You start with something like some strange lights in the sky, and you end up questioning everything you thought you knew about reality itself.
It's true, and this Hessdalen mystery, I mean, it really could be a game changer if we can figure out how to study it properly.
So where do we even begin? If we want to test this wormhole theory, we can't exactly capture a microscopic wormhole in a jar and study it under a microscope.
No, it's definitely not that simple.
Yeah.
But the paper does give us some pretty interesting paths for future research. One idea they propose is to look for something called magnetic anomalies around the lights.
Magnetic anomalies. Okay, so you're going to have to explain that one because I'm not sure I'm totally up to speed on my magnetic anomaly.
Sure. So basically the idea is that wormholes, even tiny ones, should create really strong magnetic fields. There's even some thought that wormholes might be the source of something called magnetic monopoles.
Magnetic monopoles.
Yeah. Have you heard of those?
I feel like I've heard of them, but I'm going to need a little refresher.
Okay, so a magnetic monopole, it would be like a magnet with only a north pole or only a south pole.
Right?
Which is really weird because every magnet we know of has both a north and a south pole.
Right, of course.
Like these unicorns of physics, we haven't actually found one yet.
Huh.
But some theories suggest they could exist. And if they do, wormholes might be one place to find them.
Okay, so let me get this straight. If we could detect even the tiniest magnetic monopole near a Hessdalen light, or even just a magnetic field that's acting really strangely, that would be a pretty big deal for the wormhole theory, right?
A huge deal. It'd be like finding that missing piece of the puzzle.
Exactly.
And that's just one idea. Remember we were talking about those ultrasonic sonic booms earlier?
Oh, right. We could set up a bunch of special microphones in Hessdalen that can pick up those super high frequencies that we can't normally hear and see if there's actually something going on that we're just not picking up on.
Exactly. And if we start seeing a pattern of these ultrasonic booms that seem to happen right when the lights appear, well, that would definitely give this whole micro-wormhole idea a lot more weight.
And that could even tell us more about these hypothetical wormholes too, right?
Absolutely. We might be able to figure out how often they're popping up, how big they are. Maybe even get some clues about how they form and disappear.
Wow, it's like we'd need to invent a whole new scientific field, like wormhole meteorology or something.
Wormhole meteorology. I love it. And you're right, this kind of research would really push the boundaries of what we know about physics, which is incredibly exciting.
Well, on that note, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive, but this is definitely a conversation we need to keep having. So what are your thoughts? Could these Hessdalen lights really be our window into a hidden world of micro wormholes, a dimension right alongside our own?
It's a mind-blowing thought.
It really is. Head over to our social media pages and let us know what you think. What questions does this raise for you? And if you had to design an experiment to test this wild theory, what would you do?
And for those of you who really want to go deep, we've included a link to the full scientific article in the show notes. Be warned, it's a bit of a challenge. But if you're as fascinated by this stuff as we are, we highly recommend checking it out. Until next time, keep looking up and maybe down too.
Ever get that feeling? Like some part of you is, well, out of time. Almost like you're holding on to memories for a life you never actually lived.
Yeah.
It's a thought, isn't it? Well, today we're taking a deep dive into reincarnation.
Okay.
We're following the case of E.C., a French woman whose story might just make you rethink everything you thought you knew about memory, consciousness, even the echoes of past lives.
That was intriguing.
It really is. And what's so compelling about E.C.'s story is that it's not just some vague feeling of familiarity, you know? This is vivid details. We're talking specific past life experiences.
I see. And you said some of these details can actually be verified.
Exactly. We're talking corroborated by historical records, the real deal. But here's the thing, beyond the verifiable details, it's how these potential past lives are woven into the fabric of E.C.'s everyday life. They shape her interests, even her fears. It's fascinating.
I can see why you chose this for our deep dive. It really raises some interesting questions. One thing that comes to mind is the concept of implicit memory.
Okay, so walk me through this. What does implicit memory have to do with past lives?
Well, imagine this. Your subconscious mind, it's like this vast library. It holds not just this life, right, but potentially all these whispers, these faint traces of lives lived before.
Oh, wow, okay. Like a warehouse full of old books, and we're just seeing a few pages here and there.
Exactly. And sometimes those whispers, they become these implicit memories, subtly shaping your personality, your passions, even those completely unexplainable fears without you even realizing it.
So we could be carrying around all this baggage, so to speak, and not even know it. Wild.
It really is.
So let's rewind a bit, get back to E.C.'s story. Growing up, she was always drawn to, let's say, unconventional things. Not your average girly girl, you know. Horses were her thing, adventure, that sort of vibe.
I see. So a bit of a tomboy.
You could say that.
Yeah.
And then when she was 18, she had this near-death experience, a horse riding accident, actually.
Oh, wow.
And I'm not talking about a fender bender. This wasn't just a fall. It was like this profound, life-altering event. And this event, it seemed to just crack open this door to a flood of memories, memories she never knew she had.
Like a veil lifted.
Exactly. That's a great way to put it. Suddenly, it's like she's just bombarded with these incredibly vivid, very detailed memories of a past life as a U.S. Marine.
A U.S. Marine.
Yeah, U.S. Marine named John David Smith. Not exactly what you'd expect, right? Especially with her French upbringing.
You're telling me, so this near-death experience, do you think it's possible that it somehow triggered these memories?
It really makes you wonder. I mean, we've heard similar stories before. There's definitely a documented connection between these near-death experiences and a surge in reported paranormal experiences.
Right. Like it somehow makes us more open to the possibility of other realms, other realities existing beyond what we can normally perceive.
Exactly. It's like our perception shifts, becomes more receptive, and, you know, that's precisely what seemed to happen to E.C. She started meditating, and out of nowhere, this name just pops into her head, John David Smith.
And this name, it wasn't just a random name, right?
Nope, not random at all. Remember we talked about those corroborated details? Turns out John David Smith was a real person, a U.S. Marine who died in the Vietnam War.
No way. That's unbelievable. So how did she react to that? I mean, finding out this name she'd been fixated on was actually a real person.
Well, she was definitely more than a little curious. E.C. decides to explore these memories further, and she decides to try regression therapy. Have you ever heard of it?
Yeah, I've heard of it. Isn't it supposed to be like accessing a hidden room in your mind? A room filled with memories you never knew you had.
That's a great way to describe it. It's like using hypnosis to unlock those forgotten experiences, those memories that are buried deep within our subconscious.
Fascinating. So what happened during these therapy sessions? What did she experience?
Well, during one session, she has this incredibly real, vivid experience. It's like she becomes John David Smith. She describes lying on a cot, writing a letter home. She could hear the sounds of helicopters, other soldiers around her. E.C. could even feel the weight of his fatigues, smelled the damp canvas of the tent. That's how real it was for her.
Wow. That's incredibly vivid. But it gets even more specific than that, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you mentioned earlier about her recalling even more detailed memories.
You're right, it does get much more specific, and it's this next memory that really sends chills down my spine.
Okay, I'm listening.
So, in another session, she's walking with Smith's platoon in Vietnam. She can feel the heavy rain, the mud, and then suddenly, bam, she's hit. EC feels the searing pain in her left side as she collapses. Just like that.
And that pain, did she say anything else about it?
Yeah.
Did it feel real to her?
It gets even more intriguing. You see, EC has always suffered from this chronic pain, and guess where?
Her left side.
You got it. It's an uncanny parallel, isn't it? It makes you think of phantom limb syndrome.
It really does make you wonder, doesn't it? Could the emotional, or in this case, maybe even the physical trauma from a past life, could it actually manifest in the present like that?
Exactly. It really challenges our understanding of how our past experiences, even those from potential past lives, might be impacting our physical and emotional well-being in this life. What if our bodies are holding on to more than we realize?
It's a fascinating and unsettling thought.
It really is. But hold on, there's even more to this story. It's not just these feelings or vague sensations. EC starts recalling specific details about John David Smith's life that you wouldn't believe. We're talking his childhood home, a scar he had from a childhood injury, even the heart-wrenching conversation he had with his parents when he told them he was joining the Marines. She remembers it all in vivid detail.
Wow. So it wasn't just these random details. It was specific events, specific memories that she could connect to his life.
You got it. But here's where it gets even wilder. After these sessions, EC's life takes this noticeable turn. Almost overnight, she becomes so drawn to American culture, specifically 1950s and 60s American culture.
That's quite a shift, especially considering her French background.
It really is. And I'm not just talking a general interest. We're talking 1950s, 60s music on repeat. Craving peanut butter and white bread sandwiches. I mean, very specific.
That is specific. So specific, in fact, that it's hard to imagine it being a coincidence.
And that's not even the half of it. Get this, she starts spontaneously swearing in English.
No way. Hold on, so are we talking about xenoglossy now? The idea of speaking or understanding a language you've never learned?
That's exactly what it sounds like, right? And while it's definitely a controversial topic, there are actually documented cases that suggest it might be more than just a fringe theory.
It's certainly compelling. It makes you wonder just how much of our subconscious minds we're not tapping into, how much influence those hidden depths might have on our waking lives.
It really does make you think, doesn't it? Have you ever felt this unexplainable draw to a certain culture, a certain time period, even a specific language? Could it be, just maybe, a whisper from a past life? Something calling to you from deep within?
Who knows? But it's a question worth pondering.
It really is. And speaking of whispers from the past, John David Smith wasn't the only past life EC experienced. Get ready for this, because this next one takes us all the way to Russia during the time of Catherine the Great.
Oh, wow. All right, I'm ready. Let's hear it.
Buckle up, because this one is a wild ride. This time, EC finds herself in the boots of a Don Cossack, part of the Russian Imperial Guard, no less. Talk about a change of scenery.
Wow. From U.S. Marine to Russian Cossack, that is quite a jump. So, what was this past life like for her? How did it feel different?
Well, from what I know about the Don Cossacks, they were known for their incredible equestrian skills, fierce independence, and military prowess. I mean, they were a dominant force in Russian history, especially during Catherine the Great's reign. Think about it, vast steppes, thundering hooves, and a life of freedom on horseback. That was the world of the Cossacks.
It's such a stark contrast, right? The mud and rain of Vietnam to the open steppes of Russia. And it's amazing how different EC describes feeling in this lifetime. Gone are those heavy emotions, that sense of trauma. Instead, it's all joy, this deep connection to nature and, of course, an even deeper love for horses.
That makes sense, considering their lifestyle. So she basically went from a traumatic experience to a really positive one. Exactly. She even calls it her soul's favorite life.
Wow, her soul's favorite. That's a powerful way to describe it. I've never thought about it like that before. It makes you wonder if maybe, just maybe, our souls have these affinities, for certain places, certain ways of life, and those echoes, they just, well, they resonate across lifetimes.
It really is a captivating thought, isn't it? And when we think about EC's lifelong passion for horses, her preferred riding style, her love of horse breeding, it does make you pause and wonder, are these just hobbies? Or could they be reflections of her soul's true calling, echoing through time from this past life?
I mean, I'm sure some people would just say she was riding horses as a kid, and that's how she got into it.
Right, that's the logical explanation. But then remember how she was convinced one of her own horses might be the reincarnation of her Cossack horse? That's taking it to another level.
She really believed that.
It really seems like it. And that brings up a whole other fascinating concept. We could spend another deep dive unpacking animal reincarnation.
It's definitely a fascinating concept. I mean, the idea that animals could reincarnate, it's a belief found in many cultures, isn't it?
It really is. And it just adds another layer of complexity to this whole idea of a soul's journey, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It definitely does. And I'm thinking, even if Western science hasn't really dug into it too deeply, there are so many stories and even research suggesting maybe it's time we expanded how we think about consciousness and how we're all connected, humans, animals, everything.
Exactly. It's like we talked about earlier with implicit memory. It's possible, right, that even those little quirks we have as kids, those things we just can't explain, whether it's a fear or just being drawn to something, maybe, just maybe, they're whispers from those past life connections.
I like that. Whispers from past life connections. That's a good one. So where do we go from here? Because I have a feeling EC's got more to tell us about her past lives, right?
You know it. We've covered John David Smith, the U.S. Marine, and now the Don Cossack in Russia. But those weren't the only past lives she experienced. It's like her mind was this treasure chest full of these past life memories just waiting to be discovered.
Okay, so what else came up? What other lives did she tap into?
It's almost like she'd get these quick flashes, like snapshots of other lives she'd lived. There was a Viking trader navigating icy seas. Oh, and there was a Native American healer and an Austro-Hungarian orphan.
Wow, that's a lot to process. Each one, a glimpse into this whole other existence in a different time, a different culture, a completely different version of herself. That's heavy stuff.
It is heavy stuff, and it makes you wonder, what if all of these experiences, even if they weren't what we traditionally call real past lives, how do we explain them? What if it's our subconscious just trying to process everything? All those emotions, experiences, maybe even things we've inherited in some way and we don't even realize it?
It's definitely a possibility, isn't it? Our subconscious minds, they're like these vast oceans. And these memories, they're like currents just swirling beneath the surface, sometimes bubbling up in the most unexpected ways.
I love that imagery, the subconscious as a vast ocean full of memories. So I have to ask you, have you ever had anything like that happen? Like a dream, but it felt so real? Or just a sudden, strong feeling about something? What if that was it? What if that was a whisper from a past life, just a fragment of a story, but it's your story and it's waiting to be heard? It really does feel that way, doesn't it? Like we're trying to put a puzzle together, but we've got pieces from like 10 different boxes all mixed up. How do we even know which pieces go together, let alone what the final picture is supposed to be?
It's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It's a
Right.
question that's fascinated people for centuries. And I don't know if science really has all the answers quite yet. But it does offer some interesting paths we can explore, don't you think?
Okay, so where do we even begin? How does science even start to unravel all of this past lives, implicit memory, the whole shebang?
Well, I think one of the most relevant areas we can look at is the study of memory itself. Think about it. Our memories, they aren't like video recordings, are they? They're not perfectly capturing every detail.
Right, more like those old faded photographs.
Exactly. It's all subjective, fluid, constantly being reshaped and rewritten by new experiences, our beliefs. Even our imaginations can't help but get in there and mix things up.
That's so true. How many times have you compared memories with a friend, and it's like you were both at completely different events?
All the time. It's like we each have our own version of reality playing in our minds.
Right. So now try to imagine trying to recall a memory, not just from years ago, but from centuries ago. A memory that might have even been experienced by a different version of yourself.
Whoa. Mind-blowing. How much of that could even be accurate? I mean, really. How much would time, perception, our own limited understanding of things, how much do you think that would color those memories?
It's almost impossible to say for sure. It really does make you question everything, doesn't it? We tend to place so much faith in our memories, taking them as these completely accurate reflections of the past. But what if they're actually just impressions? Open to interpretation and vulnerable to all sorts of influences we don't even fully understand.
And that's the thing, isn't it? We may never fully understand the nature of memory.
Yeah.
It's one of those great mysteries, wouldn't you say?
It really is. It makes you think how much of our past is shaping who we are in ways we're totally unaware of.
It's a mind-boggling thought for sure. And, thinking about EC's story, it really does make you think about the limits of what we know.
So how does EC's story fit into all of this? We've got these fascinating scientific concepts about memory and consciousness. But how do we connect that back to her experiences?
Well, whether we choose to see these experiences as genuine past life memories, or maybe just as products of a very active subconscious, either way, EC's story challenges us to stretch our minds. It's like she's saying, hey, what if there's more to this life than meets the eye?
I love that. It reminds me of that feeling when you first realize that the world map you grew up with, the one you thought showed you everything well, you realize it's actually got all these blank spaces on it with "Here be dragons" scrawled across them. Exciting, but also a little scary, right?
Exactly. And isn't that what makes it so exciting? Who wants to live in a world where we already have all the answers, where there's nothing left to discover?
So true. So where do we even go from here? I mean, most of us don't have access to these hidden chambers in our subconscious like EC seems to. What can we take away from all of this?
I think it comes down to a simple but powerful idea. Reincarnation aside just for a moment, I think EC's story, it's an invitation. It's a call to approach life's big questions with a sense of wonder and curiosity, to never stop asking those what-if questions.
That's a great point, because it's easy to get stuck in our routines, to stop questioning things.
It happens to the best of us. But EC's story reminds us to question our assumptions, to be open to exploring the vast, uncharted territories of the human mind, to be brave enough to say, maybe, just maybe, we're far more complex, far more interconnected than we ever realized.
So beautifully said. It's a great reminder that some of the most fascinating, important journeys we can take are those that lead inward. Really exploring those hidden depths of our own being.
Absolutely. Who knows what we might find there?
And hey, maybe, just maybe, in those quiet moments of introspection, we'll find echoes of other lives, other versions of ourselves waiting to be heard. This has been an incredible deep dive. A huge thank you to you for joining us on this mind-bending journey into past lives and the mysteries of the human experience. Until next time, keep asking those big questions and never stop exploring the uncharted territories of your own mind.